There's no more pointless fear than that of aging, because it's inevitable. Acrophobia keeps you from climbing to dangerous heights, mesophobia keeps you from harmful germs, but growing old can't be prevented. Time is always stalking us. And this is central to the recent horror film, It Follows. In the film, Jay has sex with her boyfriend, which curses her to be followed by an unnamed monster. If the monster kills her, then it will come after the boyfriend. If the monster kills the boyfriend, it will then stalk the woman who originally cursed the boyfriend with sex, and so on and so forth down the line. The monster can only be seen by those who have been cursed, but Jay's friends eventually believe her and try to protect her. After a series of close calls, Jay eventually passes the curse to her friend Paul, who then passes it to a prostitute in hopes of creating more and more distance between themselves and the monster. In the end, the fates of Jay and Paul become linked, and they will always have to look over their shoulders for a mysterious figure who can take on the guise of anyone they know. As a horror film, just as something meant to terrify you, it's excellent. The cinematography is absolutely gorgeous. Now, a long take or a oneer is certainly nothing new to cinema, but it's so effective in the horror genre. It pulls us in. It makes the experience feel more real, not a bunch of cuts to remind ourselves that we're just watching a movie. In a long take, we are forced into the scenario. We stay there. It's perfect for suspense. We are experiencing her fear, moment by moment. This long take works too, especially considering Jay is strapped to the wheelchair. That means we, too, are stuck. We, the audience, are fixed into one position. Even when her boyfriend starts moving her around, the camera stays fixed and steady. We are taking the journey with her. It creates a sense of space, but it also forces sympathy between the audience and the protagonist. It's a beautiful film, the lighting, the locations, everything. Not to mention the soundtrack inspired by late 70s and 80s horror. Listen. Although It Follows borrows from other horror films, it also breaks from recent conventions and tropes. A lot of modern horror, particularly slasher films, doesn't give us likable characters, just a bunch of jerks who we can't wait to be murdered by the serial killer. But It Follows makes us care about everyone. If your horror movie characters aren't likable, then you can actually ruin all the suspense. If you don't mind what happens to them, how can there be suspense? If we're rooting for the bad guy, then one of the most important elements of horror is lost. The sexual content of the film's premise might make one think this is an erotic thriller, but if anything, It Follows de-eroticizes sex in two ways. Firstly, it has our characters discuss sex and romance in a way that is more pure. They talk about their first kisses and accidentally stumbling on pornographic magazines without realizing why they are so bad.
It's funny. We used to daydream about being old enough to go on dates, drive around with friends in their cars. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio, driving along some pretty road.
Secondly, it de-eroticizes by never being gratuitous in its sex, even removing its erotic component. This is the closest thing to a typical sex scene in the film, and it is so sad. It is the opposite of sexy, and that's on purpose. Every other hint of nudity in the film is made revolting or incestuous or both. This film with a sexual premise is not sexy. It's not supposed to be. I think maybe people have focused too much on the more obvious parallels between what the monster represents and sexually transmitted diseases. Yes, the curse is passed through sexual activity, but I genuinely think the movie is meant to be about grander stuff than that. As the director once said, when you discuss the premise, it sounds like the worst thing ever. But It Follows works because it's actually about far more than that. Yes, there are frequent sexual references in the film. I mean, the e-reader is a pink clamshell, for God's sakes. But I feel that the sexual element of the film is far less scandalous than one would assume, given the premise. It should be noted that there are only 3 instances in which the monster puts its hands on the teenagers. In this scene, we don't actually see it touching Jay. It's invisible. In this scene, the monster gets his hands on a boy Jay had sex with, and it is in the guise of his mother. I can't show all of it, but the monster performs a sexual act on him, which ends up being fatal. The only other time a monster gets close is in this scene, in which it's in the form of Jay's father. So what does this mean? The film may be saying we unknowingly learn relationships from our parents. They're not actively doing this, but passively teaching us how to behave. You may notice that with the exception of background characters with no lines, and the false manifestation of the monster as an adult, this short scene right here is the only time a parent speaks for more than a few seconds in the whole film. We see another parent for about 5 seconds, and maybe the teacher? The barely noticed teacher who has no name and maybe no children? That's about it. The film is in a world of no parents. This feels deliberate. Like the parents have passively taught their children about life, love, sex, and death without actively doing so. And because of this, the children are actually on their own. In It Follows, they are alone. It doesn't even occur to them to ask their parents for help. Why would their parents help them with sex? Parents avoid talking to their children about it until it's too late. Why would their parents help them confront the possibility of death? We, as adults, don't even like to think about it. It Follows appears to be less about sex as it is about aging. The children are seen playing Old Maid. The eponymous card is in the middle. It Follows exists in a world in which time stretches out. There's no setting to when this takes place. The children are seen watching a black and white low-definition television. They're watching an old movie called Killers from Space. Yet in that same scene, a character is using an e-reader, modern, 21st century. Jay is seen here in an old-fashioned movie theater, classical, but the fashion is all 80s, or maybe 70s. Denim vest? It Follows is purposefully anachronistic. It draws attention to time and informs the viewer about one of the themes of the film. It Follows says a lot, but what is left to our imaginations and what we take from the film's imagery is where the film really shines. In this scene, a ball hits the window of the bathroom and Jay investigates. We discover that a young boy dressed in red is watching her. The young boy is also watching her in the pool. Early in the film, she finds this more funny than threatening. But as the film progresses, his presence becomes more sinister. Yet he never actually makes contact with Jay or her friends. He stands just this side or the other of the space between worlds. He reappears too frequently for his inclusion to be incidental. What's most terrifying about the boy is that he might represent us, the audience. There are a lot of voyeuristic shots in the film, like this one that precedes the boy's first appearance. And what of the monster itself? Well, trying to discover what it is and why it's following them will not bear fruit. The film offers no explanations about why the monster is in their universe, where it comes from, who started it, and so forth. The director has said, "I'm not personally that interested in where it comes from. To me, it's dream logic in the sense that they're in a nightmare. And when you're in a nightmare, there's no solving the nightmare, even if you try to solve it. But if it doesn't have a literal explanation, maybe a figurative one. If it embodies something, if it's a metaphor, like a point to be made outside of the narrative or as allegory, then the best label for the monster would be inevitability. The unnamed monster is the inevitability of aging, losing our childhood innocence, growing older, and dying. The inevitability of all life. Besides the fact that this film is about an unstoppable monster slowly following us forever, there are other references and clues about the true intent of the film. When Jay is in English class, her teacher reads a poem aloud. Although it's never explicitly identified, it is clearly the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, one of the most famous poems by T.S. Eliot. In it, Prufrock is a sexually frustrated man who notes that he is getting older. His stream of consciousness goes from his lack of sex life to his baldness. An even greater clue is the constant reading of The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's being read from the aforementioned clamshell e-reader. Here's the section read towards the end, as it's the most important thematically to this film. But the most terrible agony may not be in the wounds themselves, but in knowing for certain that within an hour, then within 10 minutes, then within half a minute, now at this very instant, your soul will leave your body, and you will no longer be a person, and that is certain. The worst thing is that it's certain. Let's look at one more clip.
Oh, son. I mean, how cool would that be to have your whole life ahead of you, you know?
Come on. It's not like you're old. You're 21.
I know, but look at how happy that kid is.
This is the movie. The desire for a return to innocence after experiencing the perils of adulthood. A desire to do things all over again, because the inevitability of adulthood is right there, and after adulthood there is only one thing left, and that's death. Notice that when Jay is chased away by the monster, the looming inevitability of aging and death, she retreats to a swing set, a symbol of childhood. We try so hard to avoid it. We try so hard that we pretend it's not going to happen. Like if we wrap ourselves up in our denial, we don't have to face it. If we just keep postponing it, if we just keep passing it to someone else, it won't come for us. But it does. It does, and it's just so horrible to think about being nothing. Even the ending provides little solace. Jay and Paul walk hand in hand down the sidewalk. Jay is wearing a white dress, like a wedding dress. Jay and Paul are now in a committed relationship. Because of their experience, and because they're next to each other in line for the monster, they are stuck with each other. And when one dies, the next is soon to follow. That's marriage. That's life.